Thank you for having the patience to sit with me again. I'm very happy to, as I'm sure you've noticed, speak, but I'm also very happy to discuss and converse. So, at some point, if you feel like you want me to stop, just start shifting around and I'll get it. And I'll hurry up. So I'm going to start from a provocation by the artist and writer James Bridle, who wrote on Twitter this summer, in response probably to a sort of another wave of exhibitions about climate change that were happening in the UK. And so what you see at the bottom is a review actually from one of those exhibitions, where James says there's no point making work about climate change. In times of crisis, the work has to work, it has to do work. Artistic praxis should be part of the change we wish to see, practical, educational, regenerative. Now, I'm not 100% sure that I agree with this in a kind of strict way. And we can start to problematize this. I think that there is a space for something that might feel superfluous, but in fact isn't in the arts. But I think it's a really good provocation. And it's an especially good provocation for someone who has built most of her career on an opera that is literally about climate change. This is an opera performance. You can't see it. It's called Sun and Sea. And it was made by 3 Lithuanian artists for the Venice Biennale in 2019 as the national representative of the Pavilion of Lithuania at the Venice Biennale. You'll know that the Venice Biennale has the sort of main curated exhibition and then about 90 to 100-ish sort of national representation pavilion. I think I'm saying that right, 90, yeah, more or less. So this is an opera. The people you see on the beach are singers. The singers sing their, everyday worries, things, conversations, things that feel kind of meaningless. And then beneath the surface of their songs, hidden kind of within the libretto somehow, is a sort of sense that every character who is very, is almost like an archetype of a kind of character. There's like the complaining lady, the workaholic man, the couple that met because of an atmospheric event. And you start to realize that in their sort of consciousness, or maybe in the sub-layer of the conscious, just before in the pre-conscious bit, they sense or they start to perceive or pre-perceive something that's happening, something looming, something threatening, something just out of view. And that they sort of grasp it for a second in different shapes, like plastic bags and trash on the beach and mushrooms growing at the wrong seasons and volcanic ash clouds and all kinds of things. And then they just let them go and go about their business because it's a busy beach and they're on holidays and this is exactly what they would do. So the piece had some success, and as a result of that success, it toured the world really for the last 5 years. And we've presented it in very different places, and in every place it grasps new meaning. An abandoned taxi parking space in ex-Soviet Lithuania, a Baroque theater in Rome, an abandoned Bauhaus swimming pool in ex-East Germany, 45 minutes outside of Berlin, and a art center situated directly underneath the presidential palace of Santiago del Chile. So the work changes a little bit as you place it in different contexts in relation to the architecture, but it also changes because the world outside of the walls of that presentation change. So as the work sort of traversed a rising of consciousness around climate breakdown in the context of the arts, which has very much happened over the last 5 years, plus all of the sort of uprisings that happened as around, within, and in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, plus COVID, plus so many other things that have happened since. Whilst the work doesn't change enormously, the interpretation of the work changes. So if we're talking a little bit about, making work that isn't only about climate change, I can tell you that we've tried our best to try and situate this work in its context every time that it is presented. So an example, actually back here in Santiago del Chile, in the center is a singer that comes from the northern areas of Chile, from the Mapuche community, who was invited by the company to sing specifically one particular song in which the person on the beach says, I'm hot, I'm sweaty, I'm dizzy, and there's no water left in the bottle. And so whilst the song itself is not directly political, what the significance of it being sung by our guest singer in this particular context under the presidential palace was really to try and draw attention to something that is honestly more on the public knowledge and in the public eye, like here or in London or in New York, than it is in Santiago del Chile, namely the enormous sort of privatization of areas and poisoning of waters that happen as a result of lithium minings in the northern areas in Chile and Argentina, and also the north of Portugal and other places besides, which are, in fact, lithium mining is a direct sort of result of, or I suppose the lithium is necessary towards the creation of batteries, which are a fundamental part of this idea of the green transition. So in fact, it's a green transition for who, it's a green transition how, to what extent a green transition without degrowth has any possibility of being just. And of course, whilst this piece is not expressly political, there are ways of rooting it into its space. In London, we located the piece in Lewisham, which I mentioned before, is an area of London which has incredibly high levels of toxicity and pollution, and those levels of toxicity and pollution are essentially unequally distributed along race and class lines. So not everyone in the city is exposed to toxicity and pollution in the same way. And in working with local activists, particularly a mother who had lost her young daughter to pollution, to asthma, essentially caused directly by pollution in Lewisham, in working directly with activist organizations of the neighborhood, we tried to, I suppose, contextualize something like this piece within an environmental justice framework. Now, as I showed you before, I am a curator, and I spend most of, and a training death doula. And I spend most of my time asking myself these questions: what can art do, and what do museums feel like they can do? And the reason why I say feel like they can do is because I really believe that a certain consciousness of agency is necessary to even begin to sort of relate to the question of agency, that you need to be conscious of where your agency lies, or the possibilities of your own agency, if any, of course, in order to even begin the process of doing something with it. And so all the questions that I asked you, I ask a lot of people, and sometimes they cluster very easily into different senses, but essentially I ask myself these questions because I would love for cultural institutions, and the one that I work in, to have purpose in today's sort of world, and to do so in a way that's, somewhat conscious. Now, of course, we know that every institution we've talked about it all day, every institution sits at the cross points of an enormous amount of inherited modernity, inherited colonial logic, quite a bit of unfolding of internal toxicities of different kinds, and so that institutions are by no means the perfect sort of agent for some kind of environmentally just transformation. Nevertheless, given the fact that I really believe in, the parasite as an agent of change, we've lived since 2020. We've been living through that, the enormous changes that something so small can indeed make to our societies and just lives. And so, because I believe in that, I've been working in the same institution for a very long time. And in, believing that maybe a tiny little piece of it can perhaps prototype something. So in 2018, I started a project called General Ecology, which its mission was to embed environmental purpose throughout the whole organization's programming, infrastructure, and networks. And we started with programming because I was a curator in the Serpentine at the time. So first of all, I sort of did a change of something really kind of like a cheap strategy, which was change the job title from curator of public programs to curator of general ecology. to start to open up conversations and have questions about it, but also to seed the possibility that general ecology could be, instead of a project, its own department. And that, as we'll see, was not in fact realized until this June, so 2018. It took a while. But we started with proposing projects and programs that repeatedly and obstinately dealt with questions around a very wide notion of ecology and the environment. It wasn't necessarily climate action. It wasn't, in fact, quite a lot of the project was kind of intentionally intellectually seductive, and was thinking about things like plant intelligence and interspecies communication and more than human thinking and bacteria and Gaia and all these kinds of things that, that really gathered a community of practice or an audience around the project. And the interesting thing that happens once you start to do that is that the community of audience around you starts to reflect back an image of yourself as an organization that has something to say within the sphere of ecology. Once that reflection hits back the organization, it actually behooves, it calls upon the organization to stand up to that image. And so it was by using this kind of leverage between public perception, fake it till you make it kind of, between public perception and internal wrangling, that the General Ecology Project started to take root. And if we sort of summarize it really briefly as what did it do, what does it do? Nurtures and develop cultural artifacts, so like curates art, inviting art institutions and artists to develop a deeper sense of purpose around, and it sort of clarified itself in my head over the years as environmental justice and balance. That sort of seems to hold everything that it needs to. Advocating for the role of culture and artists in environmental efforts. So placing environmental concerns and action at the heart of art making, and placing art at the heart of environmental action. Those are sort of mirrored. And then convening disciplines, specialisms, and efforts. And this is something that we have an enormous kind of privilege to be able to do in the cultural sphere, which is that cultural spaces are spaces in which those disciplines can be convened. And if you look at the kind of mechanisms and industries of so many of the specialisms that we can convene in a room within a cultural institutions, you find that actually they don't have space for that. I mean, scientific institutions often have space for artists only in as much as the artist becomes this sort of PR, or as Tino Segal says, like the graphic designer of the catastrophe, like the person that's going to translate all the stuff that the scientists do in sort of visual or somehow like emotional data. And I think that in cultural spaces, we have the chance, if we give ourselves that agency, that is, we have the chance to somehow convene disciplines in a slightly different way. Now this project is called Back to Earth, and it kind of flowed out of having had, having developed quite a large network of art, but especially non-art environmental organizations through the General Ecology Project. And for our anniversary, Serpentine's anniversary, we decided to not celebrate backwards, but actually to take responsibility forwards in time, if you like, although time doesn't exist. And to invite 50, who then became 64, or 100, I don't know, artists to propose environmental campaigns, artworks that are also simultaneously an environmental campaign or intervention or prototype. We had these different words to try and inspire different responses. And we had a vastly sort of wide range of responses and proposals. It behooves me to say that we haven't realized them all necessarily, that some of them have become really infinitely long-term projects. So in the example of Climavore, who are artists and spatial practitioners that look at changing the way we eat and restaurant systems and consumer to restaurant relationships and like chef education and things like this in such a way that we eat things, the production of which is beneficial to the environment. This is a project that we've been working on for the last 4 years and probably have just committed for another 100. Others were just like quick realizations, like Yoko Ono's posters, "I Love You Earth," which appeared throughout the UK on billboard sites. Some of them, and in fact I'm going to show you this, which is, not that you can see it, but as we started to somehow map out these projects, we didn't realize them all, but what they gave us is a huge amount of I'm going to say data, but huge amount of sort of research material around what artists think their agency is in terms of environmental action, that breadth. And what we found is we could cluster them. I mean, we don't have to, but we can cluster them in all kinds of ways. And we decided to cluster them in our minds just to start that research process. Places, speculations, systems, and publics. This is a cluster system that's made based on, to a certain extent, trying to orient how the cultural institution is in us. We needed to respond to the project or to support it in order to achieve what it wanted to achieve. So systems look at changing things like, you know, curriculum, policy, food systems, and so on. So really get into the infrastructures of the ways that, you know, the things that hold the world in place. Publics really have to do with that kind of awareness piece. So like you measure the success of a public's work by going, this many people saw it, you know, or this many people interacted with it or clicked or donated or whatever. Speculations are works that, and this is where I slightly disagree with James, speculations are those works that, whilst they don't directly immediately give you an impression of what they are doing, nevertheless propose or imagine alternative paradigms, alternative ways of imagining origins, futures, more human and more than human relations, and so on. And in proposing those paradigms, they also seed something into the wider consciousness, into the wider intelligence, I think. And that has value, even though that value cannot be immediately measured by the measures by which we hold ourselves accountable in the cultural field, or our funders hold us accountable, maybe, which tends to be numbers, actually. Places is quite beautiful. It's, there were artists, such as Tabitha Rezer in this case, and Caribbean Film Collective, who essentially just explained to us that they wanted this project to be supportive of a particular place located somewhere very specific on a map or on the planet. And therefore, the kind of the challenge, I suppose, of the invitation was for the organization to figure out systems of creating that connection and creating that support without, you know, going somewhere else and planting a flag called the Serpentine flag, you know, without having any relationship that had any form of ownership whatsoever to those places. So in case of Amakaba, which is the Center for the Study and Archiving of practices around the body, the arts and sciences of body, earth, and sky, yes, in the forests of French Guyana. We worked with Tabitha Rezer to do things like build the website for the site, or create a sort of media campaign that invited publics to donate to the building of the site itself, or sort of think about what knowledge exchanges we could find in our network, and then how that could potentially be useful for the, you know, at this birth moment. We built a lot of websites, actually. Carabing also had a website from the Back to Earth project. Now we're taking that Back to Earth project. We thought it would be infinite, but it's not. We're winding it down, but what we're doing is we're taking all of the proposals and all of the materials from that project and really all of that research material to start a next phase of inquiry, which has widely to do with what's art's role in the environmental emergency. So it's not finished, but it's also finished. And here, this is an event that we did in October called the Infinite Ecologies Marathon, The Prelude. And that had to do with the fact that the marathon format is a format that the Serpentine, or our director, I suppose, is quite well known for, which is originally the super punitive, like every 15 minutes a different thing, interdisciplinary kind of festival mess. It lasts 24 hours. Everybody's exhausted at the end. I'm not saying it literally kills people, but it metaphorically really kills people. Even though it's like this super like pantagruelic, like knowledge, you know, it really belongs to its time because it's a child of the 90s, late 90s. And it lasted for a very long time. It changed its format so that it went from 24 hours straight to 12 hours over a day for 2 days, gentle, to, you know, every once in a while we did it a little bit, like one day instead of two, but it never really changed this pace. So what we wanted to, we interrupted it in 2018, and maybe that was a good thing, but it came back. And so what do you do then? So what we decided to do was to make a prelude event, which would be shorter. I mean, in the end, it was 8 hours long, so it was already quite punitive. But the idea was we invited our participants to the prelude to put things on the agenda for the festival that will happen in July of 24. So we asked 2 questions to everyone. What is underrepresented on the environmental agenda today? And what is not yet represented on the environmental agenda, but will be in the near future? And with those 2 questions, we were hoping that the participants would bring things out of view and would bring us kind of a shape, in a sense, and a steer in a direction that would give us a purpose for why we're doing July of 24. It turns out that whilst all the participations were brilliant in themselves, I don't personally think that much was brought to the table that wasn't already on the agenda or on the table before. With the exception of all of those moments and those encounters. Now bear in mind this is October of 2023, so also quite a particularly traumatic moment in the history of the world and in this mediatized culture. What are we what are we doing there? Doing like 15 minutes after 15 minutes of talking about environmental issues as though they're separate from the planet we're living on in that moment. So there was a big, if it was going to bring anything on the agenda, I think the one thing that it brought on the agenda is in those moments in which, through language, we can so easily just polarize and just burst into flames and then separate in some kind of weird magnetic chemical way. The practices of eating together, being together, moving together, holding each other, artistic performances, ritual, created the conditions occasionally during the prelude and would have created the conditions if we did more of it for a different kind of compassion, a different kind of, like grace. So in thinking about what it's going to be next year, we're thinking of doing something much, much slower, like it might go on for a month. It might be 24 hours, but actually 24 days of 1 hour each, so that we can, one day maybe have a food encounter, one day we walk through the park, one day, teenagers learn about climate litigation to become lawyers of the environment, one day, to really kind of allow for that breathing room between the different events, acknowledging the fact that in a world in which we're exposed to, I think something, I don't want to give the exact number, but an exponential number more of, say, advertisements than the one that we are cognitively capable of holding, there is really a responsibility in terms of our institutions to and I think one of you put it on the post-its, but really to rework the temporalities. And by temporalities also the ethics of how we're doing things and where we're doing them. So you can see these layers like subject matter, but also the how, also the who with, also the who for, and so on. All of that, all the way down and all the way up, sort of becomes part of a kind of holistic ecological thinking around the organization. Now, this table, we don't have to stop with it, but essentially I did a seminar more or less like the one that we did before, like an exercise, with all the post-its. And some things emerged around like art for knowing, for experiencing differently, for acting or mobilization, for imagining differently, transforming systems, prototyping. And it became quite clear as I was writing the strategy for Serpentine for the next 3 years that every single one of those things that art can do needs the cultural institution to behave and be something different. And so I tried to somehow make this, it's really just an example to say that if art can be a driver for imagining different worlds or shifting paradigms, then the cultural space needs to allow itself to be a dreamscape or a strategist or a laboratory or a sanctuary and so on. And this is not just speculative, it literally means a different way of organizing the room, a different way of organizing the time, a different way of organizing the finances of what we're doing, etc., etc. I have to choose between telling you about artworks and telling you about language. I think we've talked about the collapse of metaphor and material in today's environmental breakdown. This is a underground space that was, I'm sure you've seen this picture, it was used as a shelter during an extreme heat wave in China just this past summer. And if we think about the ways that artists have contributed to spaces, for example, this one is actually a morgue in a hospital that the Italian artist Ettore Spalletti designed or painted and designed. If we think about, you know, the real and material reality of art being a space to hold moments of deep transformation, challenge, and, you know, every transformation is a death, every death is a transformation, of course, so those two things I'm kind of using interchangeably. Then how can the museum, when it wants to be a shelter space, how does it think of itself as a shelter space for the mind and for the soul, and also literally as a shelter space in a moment of collapse or in a moment of challenge? How do we really start to think about what those porosities are? I mean, a little bit what Florencia, for those of you who were here, was speaking about before. Those literal porosities, literal moments of encounters, the metaphorical aspects of what we do, and the literal one. Now, I really do want to go into the artworks because I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of, collapses of worlds, I guess. Now, in 2019, this is a still from a film by the Argentine artist Adrián Villar-Rojas. I was taught how to pronounce it, and now it just gets me stuck all the time. Who started to record these, just kind of scrape off the internet, these cameras, videos, thousands of hours of camera footage from mainly webcams that were pointing at zoos or like at animals in zoos, mainly. And he edited this incredibly long 2-channel film where really, and this is during the COVID pandemic, so himself and his studio's colleagues are all in their own homes recording videos on their own hard drives. An enormous production. And then these, so in this moment in which the human world is completely confined to different sort of spaces because of a pandemic, these kind of indifferent, more than human beings in zoo contexts find a different kind of a different forms of existence, an existence without the eyes of the human. Now, the thing that I find very poignant about this is that ever since this film, Adrián has called every single project of his, every single work of his has been called The End of Imagination since this film. And even though I can't quite yet articulate it in words in a moment like this one, why I think this is complete fucking genius, I also still really think that instinctively this is exactly, it speaks exactly to the kind of broken ness that the kind of progressive alienation that COVID brought in terms of like hyper-reliance on technological devices, progressive separation from community, and so on. It speaks exactly to something that got broken with and during the COVID pandemic that I think we were all too quick to forget or too quick to sort of just accelerate past. And yet things are really, really different now than they were in 2019. And I'm old enough to remember it. So this is a photograph by a photographer from Rosario, which is the same town that Adrián has his studio in, of the Paraná River, which is the river that runs past Rosario. And Rosario is today is an incredibly dangerous city to be in. And the words that are on everybody's mouth are always soya, and narcotráfico. And because of its position on the river, that's exactly what made it so wealthy in the 1850s, where it became this port town in the way that you imagine it, so futuristic and, you know, sexually liberated and loose and dangerous, and where you could make your own fortune and so on. Huge influx of Italians actually into Rosario in the 1850s. And then it went through different processes and, of, you know, boom and bust and different things. And then now the structures that, you know, the plantation structures that were organizing the way in which Rosario relates to the world are exactly the same, except right now it's the monocultural plantation of soy and the sort of raising of land to put cattle farms onto. And this is just the cemetery of Rosario where Lucio Fontana, the artist, actually, that's his first ever sculpture. Now, on the other side of the river is the wetlands of Entre Rios. And in Entre Rios, there were an enormous number of fires last year. just a few months before I arrived in Rosario. And Sebastian, who is a photographer, photographed quite a lot of this. Now, most of these fires are human-made because the wetlands are protected, but if they're burned to the ground, then they can be bought and sold and re-established with cattle farms. So Rosario for months was completely inundated, and this is a story that we've heard in a lot of places, Brazil, California, and so on, completely inundated with smoke. And so there's all these stories from the colleagues of Adriano in his studios that I heard about putting towels in the windows and blocking the arrival of the smoke in indoor spaces. Now, if we think about the fact that Adriano was working on this, he was working on a major commission from the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Australia, which is a number of enormous, crazy sculptures, like visionary to the point of crazy, sculptures that he created by, first of all, building these digital worlds. So he would build digital worlds together with a massive team. And then inside those digital worlds, he would place materials and objects and sculptures and things. And then he would run and simulate in those worlds all kinds of catastrophes, the acceleration of time, war, earthquakes, all kinds of things. And what they would do to that material, the studio would then try and bring back and repropose into this. Now, where does world meet art in this? For me, it's really significant that at the same moment that there was an enormous ecological devastation and ecocide happening just across the river, and the smoke was literally coming into the studio. What the artist is doing is burning material, mashing it, melting it, making it, traumatizing it, literally. So there's a kind of processing that also happens in art that I think is really important and incredibly unique in terms of ways of expressing. Now, very, very briefly, I also had the great chance to meet the director of the Museum of History and Anthropology of Rosario, who is an expert in local works from the period. Sometimes, like the Getty calls it arte colonial, or like colonial art, but it's like the period 1500s to 1800s, made by local artists, but of primarily imposed Christian religious images. And what he's an expert in, and so are a number of books that then he recommended I read, is ways in which the artists who were forced to be painting Christian iconographies instilled, hid really, within the paintings seeds from the local areas, sacred colors that belonged to traditions and religions and rituals that predated the arrival of colonialism, and other kinds of sacred forms in such a way that one set of practices could be that was being absolutely annihilated, could be worshipped in the let's say, belly of the practice that was being imposed. In this syncretic moment, in this moment in which things are both one world and another, we see the passage of time. We experience exactly, well, as observers and really invited visitors at this point, experience in real time what an end of a world and a beginning of other world really looks like or feels like. And so in this, I will skip this altogether, Emilia Scarnorite's films about kind of traumatized earths. But in this interregnum, as I keep calling it, of today, where ecological collapse and the polycrisis that define today give so many, at least artists, in this case I wouldn't say us, but so many artists, so many practitioners that I've had the chance to work with, so many thinkers, the sense of being at the edge of a world, really at the edge of something. And so does Vanessa, actually. Vanessa, in her book, she speaks exactly about this, something that is dying, leaving space for something else. These things that happen at the edge of a world are also things where, the artistic experience of it and the material and physical and planetary experience of it have a relationship that is like weird and vibrating and somehow closer than it then becomes. It's like things just become really, really kind of energy-filled at this particular moment. So for me, the question, of course, is how does one then encourage the cultural institution? I mean, this is what I do, but so I worry about cultural institutions as opposed to something else. But how does one encourage the cultural institution to become the kind of space that can hold with care? I said I never said care. That can hold with dignity, that can hold with humility, that can hold with compassion and grace, moments of great and profound transformation, and can do so in the face of the increasing cruelty that defines the systems that hold the world in place today. So to conclude, a bit late, some of the questions that will concern me for the next 3 days are these, like mind and consciousness beyond the human, the agency, role, and responsibility of art and culture in the environmental sector, and then how to transform the cultural sector in times of change. Really, there's a shadow. I mean, directors don't want to hear things like ends of worlds and crisis and things like that. So there's kind of a shadow question, which is really about this kind of hospicing work, this holding work, kind of learning, relearning a form of acceptance of a kind of death or transformation as part of the role of the cultural institution. We don't say it, but that's what we're going to try and do. And you know, there's all kinds of strategies that we're using. We're developing a systems-focused and artist-led approach to climate action through the cultural institution. I can go into details later, but it's probably not super sexy. Considering everything that we do as part of an ongoing research, so the public manifestations of projects are never the end point of a set of research, but they're actually points along the way. And every single one of those things, like the prelude that I was describing to you before, gives us feedback that then allows us to kind of continue to readjust. So have a sense that the outcome is kind of never there, but everything is an open research process. Prototyping things that we're talking about literally and directly within the organization. So for example, there's a whole set of programs now that we're going to start called the Unanswerable Questions Forum, which is why I called those two kind of sections of the workshops 1,000 Ideas and Unanswerable Questions. The Unanswerable Questions Forums will be an artist-led program for only staff members of the Serpentine in order to sort of, the idea is to kind of develop a sense of purpose or like a soul in the organization that isn't like the top line mission, vision, yada yada that every organization needs to have. And to do that through and with artists. So this is going to be like a public program, but internal, for instance. Then thinking really about like what's missing in terms of sectoral infrastructures and how to create or foster or nurture or invite networked projects in such a way that there's a kind of mutual support or holding that happens. And then really thinking very deeply, and this is really important to me, even though it's like super mega not sexy, but like really thinking about how we can rewrite the measures by which we measure success in the art world, because at the moment they are just incredibly lacking in depth. I've already read you this quote, so I don't need to, but I'll read this one because who mentioned Le Guin? Julia, did you?
Yeah, I did.
There you go. So Le Guin writes, prior to this is one of my favorite passages of all time. Prior to the preeminence of sticks, swords, and the hero's killing tools, our ancestors' greatest invention was the container. The basket of wild oats, the medicine bundle, the net made of your own hair, the home, the shrine, the place that contains whatever is sacred, the recipient, the holder, the story, the bag of stars. And I think, really, that maybe not all of the culture or all of art, but certainly that which concerns itself, probably all of you, that place in art that concerns itself with embedding justice, embedding grace, embedding purpose within the work that we do is that. It's the net made of your own hair. It's the thing that opposes itself to the hero's killing tools, which, let's face it, are the things that organize the planet at the moment. Thank you. We can discuss like this, we can discuss over wine, whatever you want.
Who has a question? Don't be scared.
We also chatted so much all afternoon, but...
I have one. Very simple. Could you give us an idea of what Serpentine is? How it looks like, where it is situated?
Oh, yeah.
How you could reach out into the outside world, so to say, and how because I find it crucial Florentina, no, said. Okay, it's shown, I think.
So it's, oh no, I can describe it. So in London, in the West, there's a park that's looks like a square, but half of it is called Kensington Gardens and half of it is called Hyde Park. Within that is one of the palaces of the Queen. And somewhere around there is an ex-tea house in the park that was converted to a gallery about 50 years ago. And over time went from like a gallery that occasionally showed student sort of exhibitions to a contemporary art gallery that does what a contemporary art gallery does. So it's called a gallery, but it's not a commercial space. It's called a gallery and not a museum because it doesn't have a collection. And it's quite small. It expanded into a second building, which interestingly was a gunpowder storage from the 18th century in the same park, because apparently the gunpowder storage of the Queen before that was like under a bridge, which is like a really dumb place to put gunpowder storage. Anyway, so then it was put like literally in the middle of a park, and those two galleries were, well, the second gallery was open in 2013 with an expansion, a rather dramatic extension by Zaha Hadid, which is like this kind of floaty, canvasy type restaurant on the side. So it has a small footprint as a gallery. And it's funny, anyone who knows its program but hasn't been, when I take them around, they say, oh, I thought it was much bigger. And I think it's because its program is just bigger than the space, because it comprises also like commissions and offsite things and all kinds of stuff. So, and I really don't like programming for the galleries themselves, or I also don't get a chance to, but I also wouldn't love it, because they're very sort of, because I like to program outside of the exhibition space. So I prefer having to invent how to program. And so, and the good thing about that is that when you're missing a platform or an infrastructure, you build it, you make it. So over the course of the years, in 2015, we needed something, and we started a radio. And from that radio grew the podcast project. And now the podcast is held by a completely different department that curates it and takes care of it. But it was an infrastructure that we just built out of a need to communicate with the audience that was different from what was available. And now we're still doing the same. We're working out, how to, whether it's by a program that travels through cinemas or whether it's all kinds of print. There's ways that we haven't even thought about. But really this idea that as you're building projects and programs, you're also building the capacity to support them, or you're also building the infrastructure that holds them, for me is like super important. I don't know why.
Maybe speaking of the restaurant, I've been there during the Back to Earth project, and also actually 2 days after the Queen died. So like, it was a very impressive moment to see. But maybe I would just be interested to hear a little bit about maybe the restaurant, how it's going with it's this artist project that we just heard of from
the Climavore project.
Climavore. And for me it was super, super interesting to see how the practices intersect, and that some people didn't even know about the project. And I spoke to the chef, also a bit to the people of the staff, and it was super interesting to get like all these different viewpoints, and then also the people in the gallery who worked there.
Oh wow, you spoke to a lot of people. That's awesome.
Yeah, I tried to. Yes, it was really nice actually, and very welcoming also. Just hard to catch up and then after, but because it's super nice. It's a space like it's in between the outside and the inside of the institution. So for me it was like there came so many things together. Yeah.
You mean this one? It exists?
No, this is an image about the Climavore project. I will show you from my phone. So them cooking sections, long story short, they're looking at the food systems, and in particular they have a number of projects in an island in the north of Scotland, which has been badly affected by essentially multinational salmon farming corporation arriving and subletting all the fishermen's kind of areas. And basically now it's all the fish farms on the island are working on behalf of Scandinavian multinational corporations. salmon farming. Now, if you look into salmon farming, you will never eat a salmon again because it's like so gross. You can't imagine it. Like what happens to these poor salmons that are swimming in circles. The fact that their flesh in a farm wouldn't be pink because they don't eat the kind of krill that they need for the flesh to become pink. So they're actually fed coloring pills. And there's actually, and this is Alon and Daniel Dim who showed me, there's a book that Roche, the pharmaceutical company, does, and it's like a Pantone color book of your salmon, and you can choose your salmon flesh, and it's a different kind of pill. Yeah, true story, otherwise it would be gray. And it has devastating effects on the environment of the area because it's very toxic because of all the antibiotics and what have you. They get all these kinds of lice, so then you have to get the antibiotics, and it's a mess. And they have a super destructive social function because the fishermen on the islands are, all of a sudden subsistence farming on behalf of another corporation that reaps most of the benefit. So what they've started to do in Sky is to try and get a sort of systems view of things and try and change the entire chain in such a way that there would be an economically viable way for salmon farmers to pivot and become farmers of oysters and mussels, which are both filter feeders and thusly like purify the waters that they find themselves in, that they grow in. So this is a performance table where they did these dinners and performative dinners, but it's also an oyster table. So under the table, there's like oyster. They need to grow in tidal zones. So there's like those cages are like oyster cages. So they work with that. They set up a cooking school that teaches chefs how to work, how to sort of develop dishes that are with sort of climate positive ingredients, and so on and so forth. And so when they came to Serpentine with a project, they said, well, we want to replace the salmon on your restaurant's menu with, they call them climivore dishes. And so we did that in 2020. And the cool thing about it is that the people that run the restaurant at the Serpentine are called Benugo, and they are a massive company that runs restaurants in most cultural institutions across the entire UK. So when we said to them, would you like to replace salmon with climivore dishes? And would you like to do it across all of your restaurants? They just went, sure. So all of a sudden, it was a project that went from like one tiny prototype to like a national rollout. Now, over time, those things change, of course, and the restaurant has developed its own relationships to regenerative grain farmers and all kinds of other things. And so it's possible, it's conceivable that the Climivore project is one of those things that like changes something and then kind of steps back. I keep telling them that they should describe it like in the same way that you do dating apps, like the apps that's meant to be deleted. It's like Climivore is the project that's meant to eventually disappear because it's not needed in a place anymore. I don't know if they'll take on my marketing strategy. And so what we're working on now is together, and this is why I say that we've probably just committed for another half decade, is really looking together at, well, they're looking at it anyways, but really kind of becoming involved in their drive towards getting culture at the table of food policy, kind of spaces of decision making, and really sort of connect farmers, food policymakers, and artists together and convene them and try and like change food systems through culture, really. So as an update to what your question was, Benugo still has, across many restaurants, most restaurants, climivore dishes on its menu and no longer has salmon. If you spot salmon in a Benugo restaurant, write me an email. But yes, but we're kind of evolving the project to its next phase, I suppose. Thank you. Thank you. Why am I sorry, thank you. Yes, yes.
I kind of tried to formulate my question more precise, but somehow I can't. I don't know, my mind is too full. But you mentioned Amakaba by Tabitha Rezer, and I think, yeah, that's a really like detailed question. But how? Because I know her work from the time before, where she was looking a lot on the question like how to trace coloniality within material digital infrastructures. And yeah, she made this incredible video essays that were called like post-internet aesthetics, maybe from some. I don't know if you know her work. And then now she shifted into creating, as you said, though, this place, no? So she was in this category of places, no? Yeah. Placemaker. So I was super interested into this change because I felt that she did this in a moment where there was a shift, like from attention from one super topic, which was digitalization, to another, which was ecology. And I just wanted to have your opinion on it. Like, how did you perceive her the shift in her practice, and would you say that this points towards some kind of paradigm change in contemporary art? Would you say that it stands for something? Because I had the feeling that her particular movement from one focus point to the other were connected, deeply connected, but then also maybe stood for a kind of attention raising and like collective emergence of some, you know, feeling of emergency. And I just wanted to know what your opinion is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I can see what you mean in terms of like how those shifts, but then again, I tend to think that those shifts happen civilizationally, kind of in synchronicity, like that we all are fish swimming in water and never pay any attention to the water, but once you start, you realize that its composition changes and it changes the way that we behave in the air. and I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in like what Keller Easterling, who is an amazing, I think I have here, no, maybe I don't. Keller Easterling, who's an amazing architectural theorist, describes as the medium or matrix within which things are suspended. I don't have it. The medium or matrix within which things are suspended and in which they change over time. And that if you become conscious of that stuff that's between things, you start to recognize, maybe even in a paranoid way, simultaneities and connections and weird, what that quantum physicist Anton Zeilinger calls spooky action at a distance and all this kind of stuff. So yes, at the same time, the conversation with Tabitha was quite an interesting one. And I think, you know, some of it is probably to be shared in a less formal context, but because I also don't want to speak for her own trajectory, but I had a feeling, at least when we began to work with her on this project, she was very adamant that Amakaba was not an art project. It's like, this is my work as an artist and this is not my art project, but this is what I want to do. There was also a sense that the art sort of system had caused a certain degree of weariness, alienation. Not just Tabitha, I mean, everyone. This is also like COVID times. And so, you know, it may speak to the need to some kind of like paradigmatic need for a shift or a need to ground. It may also speak to an individual's need to ground. Those two things are nested within one another and I think mutually dependent, potentially. So, and Tabitha continues to sort of show certain works from, and I think has made works since this, but she's really, really rooted in French Guiana. She was spending a lot more time in Paris before, and yeah, has learned how to it's not biodynamic, but it's permaculture. I can't remember which sort of technique, but a cacao farm that follows those principles and then has really gone around many parts of South America, but also other parts of the world to kind of try and archive those deep kind of birth doula body knowledges and astronomical knowledges, and has made like video projects around there. So there's dialogue. I would be curious to know whether Amakaba is still not an artwork. I understand why she felt like that was important to sort of state. I wonder if there's more blurriness now, but I can't speak for it. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you for sharing. And it's really great to hear that marathon is slowing down.
I hope so. There seems to be agreement even from my director, so I'm really...
I used to follow his marathons in China, and but I have a question for you. because it seems that there is kind of a little bit of you distancing from exhibitions, which are Serpentine's landmark, right? And your position, as far as I understood, it's of the public program, more of. So I'm interested, maybe you can a little bit unpack of curatorial position of the public program, because it seems I keep learning through the history of curatorial these positions of the margins that are kind of very fertile positions of testing and changing, rather than like working with exhibitionary formats. From the position of curator of public program that you have.
So it's absolutely true that from the point of view of trajectory, I went from being the curator of public programs, which was basically everything time-based, so discourse, but also film and performance, to this ecology project. There was a need. I came back from a period on maternity, and I came back with a sort of strong sense that I needed to change the way I thought, sort of find new life and find new meaning in what I was doing. And there was a long history of having been involved in public programs that had to do in some way or another with ecology and the environment. So it emerges definitely out of public programs. It emerges out of, for sure, the fact that I didn't study art history or art. So it was like literature, critical theory, gender studies, and mourning, psychoanalysis, whatever. So it was like an interdisciplinary kind of mess for me to begin with. And I thought public programs was a really good place to sort of, for that mess to kind of find meaning, I guess. And so it emerges out of that. It's also true that, I mean, maybe true, I don't know. It is also my opinion that, so in terms of like organizational size, I tend to notice that the bigger an organization is, the more concerned it becomes with its own reproduction or with its own survival. And this is something that, forgive me if, I mean, I say it a lot, but so much so that when you start to look at the missions and the visions and the statements and all this stuff that they have online, oftentimes you realize that the use of the word sustainability or resilience actually mainly means their own sustainability and their own resilience, right? So, thank you. So, silent clapping. Also, and which one? In Mexico. Oh, I like this. So for me, and maybe, I mean, I don't know, I just didn't train through that anyways, but like for me, I think you're right in hinting, I think you hinted at the fact, or maybe I'm just totally projecting, that the exhibition format has a tendency to want to reproduce itself as well, because it has this given space and it has the given parameters and it has the history and all the rest of it. Serpentine is a space that doesn't have an auditorium, and I'm sure that if it did, a bunch of projects that came out of Serpentine that are like really like, because ecologies is not the only one, but that are like really about systems and research and all that, would not have emerged. Why? Because we would have had an auditorium and we would have just done talks in the auditoriums and screening in the auditoriums, and that's the end of that. So out of a sort of lack of resources, and I can assure you that my budget for general ecology was, and in fact is, like tiny, and that most of the stuff that you've seen has been done with in-kind support and in-kind exchanges of possibility. Like a lot of it is done in alternative economic systems. With that lack of resources comes the possibility of a kind of invention. I'm not saying that it's great. I mean, you want to pay your artists properly, you want to pay the freelancers properly, there's some basic things. But I think, not having a space makes you invent the possibility of a space that might not look like a space. Not having an enormous amount of sort of financial resources might make you look at value and exchange in a way that doesn't look like finance, and so forth. And so, whilst I don't think that it's necessarily it emerges from public programs per se, as it happened in that particularly situated context, there was more of a lack of resources that allowed for a different kind of search. and that search also took place through research. So there's a quite, the sort of three foundational, what is now known as the three foundational pillars of Serpentine's commitment: ecologies, technology, and civic engagement in public practice, are research strands, really. Like, they start from this long-term engagement with fundamental questions that artists accompany us in sort of investigating. And because of the fact that ecology is, at least I can speak for that, but it's definitely programs, but it's also infrastructure, and it's also ways of doing things, and it's also organizational transformation, and it's quite cybernetic in that sense. It had to also sit, and this is the story I haven't told you, and which was that general ecology was part of the curatorial and programming team. And I'd rejoined in June, writing a job with a mandate in a department that was finally its own. I wanted it to sit outside of programming because I wanted it to do things that aren't programming. I wanted it to be able to do programming, but also work with all the other departments to embed environmental and environmental justice principles throughout everything that the other departments did. Not just this dichotomy that art institutions tend to be stuck within in terms of being aware of one's own agency, which is awareness raising over here, reducing our own carbon footprint over here. Those are two super important things, but it's really just beginning to scratch the surface of all the things that an art organization might have the agency to do if it starts to free itself from what it thinks it's got the agency to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you. So I have many different questions, but I will stick to one, which is connected to this slide. And as you know, I've been following, and I'm very interested into your sort of shift from the curatorial, the program, towards the infrastructure. There is actually one word, going back to semantics, right? Which is perhaps something that, you had to decide whether artworks or semantics. So I'm giving you a hint to delve into the semantics. There is one word in this slide that kind of really sort of was kind of created like one of these moments of awakenings, which is publics. So public, it's like a word that I'm not finding anymore so often, especially when we think about art institution in relation to ecology, because I mean, like, it kind of, there is like an underlying understanding, but correct me if you see it in another way, of a certain passivity, a certain passive attitude behind public, that perhaps that's also why we have spoken today about ecologies, about soils, about, also like how porous the walls of an institutions could be. And I want to connect to Sun and Sea, and how actually, I find it really beautiful about how actually the work, so the content do not change. I imagine like the script and the music do not change, or the singing do not change, but actually through my interpretation, through like the changing context, the work do change, like the interpretation of the work change. And I do understand that actually these changing interpretation emerge from conversation you have with activists, with different people that experience your work or that allow you to realize the work in a different context. So I'm wondering if, thinking ahead, and then you also very generously already shared some ambitions that the upcoming ecologies program has in terms of organizational transformation, mind and consciousness.
Yeah, open research, prototyping stuff, I don't know, a bunch of stuff that works on a strategy.
Etc. There was like many references to the institution and to the artist. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, in your infrastructural thinking, where what we might call the constituencies or the ecologies comes in?
So I'm going to try and take this one at a time. It's a hard question. Publics, I realize when you're saying that probably it was intended as passive when it was used to describe this particular kind of work, also in part because there was already in our kind of group of practitioners who were taking this forward a slight suspicion around works that are like, put a sentence in front of 1 million people. I mean, I love Yoko profoundly, but just in terms of like, yes, and then what? Like, there was always like a so what raising awareness? We're in such insane bubbles that like the likelihood that we're going to communicate anything to anyone outside of who we exactly know, you know, except if you really go and work, like the work of some practitioners is like super legit, but really like, and so what? You know, there was a kind of so whatness to it. So I think that the word public maybe emerged out of a certain cynicism around it. But as you were talking, I was reminded of, and this is, I wrote my thesis in part of on a beautiful work by Felix Gonzalez Torres called Portrait of Ross in LA, which is a candy stack. Are you familiar with this? It's, so just to briefly to summarize, candy stack of the weight of the partner of Felix, Ross, who died of the consequence of HIV, AIDS, and the candy stack is the weight of it, and the audiences, the publics, are invited to sort of take a candy and eat it and walk away with it, and the museum's responsibility is to keep the weight at the same weight as Ross. And in speaking about that work, Felix says something that I think is gorgeous about public art. He says we call public art that is just too big to fit indoors, but actually this really felt like public because it has an erotic relationship and a mourning relationship and a sharing relationship and a ritual one with with the lover that I'm mourning, with my partner, with the public. He explains moments in which he had enormous grief watching the public take pieces of, his kind of instantiated or recrystallized or reprojected sort of love of his life. He describes moments in which he wants to go and talk to people and ask for it back. And so the idea that is also public, that there's a kind of demoting of agency in the public that happens over time, so that now the public is like engagements on Instagram, follows, conversion rates. Like that's how we speak about publics. That Felix completely challenges when he says something like, this thing. Invites us to think about things like the public in relation to the commons, the public in relation to mobilization, a bunch of other possible publics which come much closer to ecologies and constituencies. Now in the strategy, the word constituency doesn't appear, but the word stakeholders does, ecosystems and ecologies do, and what's the other one? And then the word indirect. So when in this whole complex but at the same time stupidly simple system for embedding environmental principles throughout the organization, there's one that talks about influencing indirect action or influencing indirect emissions or waste. And that really will be some of the ways in which we interface with the constituents or the publics, which will be to try and think about initiatives that really try and take the principles of the work that we're trying to do outside of the walls of, outside of looking at we reduce the carbon of us only, but really try and think about once you have that connection to a bunch of people, 40,000 people on our newsletter, what do you do with that newsletter? Can you do something with that newsletter that is more than sending the news, in a sense? So I think there's it's all open for, if we want to reclaim some terms, but not only the term, the concept, it's all open for, it's all fair game,
I think it's perhaps, my question was also about rebalancing the relation, right? Also also the narrative voice, or, who's creating the meanings and who's receiving the meanings, or how the meanings are co-created.
Yeah.
So I think that was, and indeed it's not a matter of the word or, the semantic or the choice of the vocabulary, but the vocabulary is also enacting and performing it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would, to that, in terms of co-creation and the unbuilding the education thing, I want to make an acknowledgement, which is sometimes the work that I'm involved in is, I relate to people that not refer to it, but sort of sometimes describe it as adjacent to social practice. And I just want to say very, very clearly that I'm not equipped to claim any kind of work around social practice. It is not the work that I do. I wish I knew how, but I don't. I like the term ecological practice because it has an enormous amount of like poetry and possibility and play around, and also purpose, but a different kind of purpose. But I think that, you know, I was trained in a curatorial form, which the basics of which is I stand over here giving a lecture and answering questions, and you sit over there asking questions. I mean, I know that this is, I hope, not the relationship that we're having here, but maybe it is, you know. The basic format of my profession, my own trajectory, starts with an incredibly, you know, deconstructible premise. And it took me years. You know, I've got colleagues who've been working in public practice who've been doing like unbuilding the public event for years, you know, and now it's like, oh, Lucia realizes finally that like sharing food is much more important. Like you know, it's like super, super late. so it's not, you know, these are transformations that I think I would like to know that I make with an open heart, but with absolutely no claim to, you know, they're learned from other spaces which traditionally in institutions have also had very, very little acknowledgement. The spaces of public engaged practice and community-based practice and education, and all of those spaces are spaces that were underfunded, undervalued, underrecognized for decades. So I just wanted to put it out there because it's like, it's important to say, I think, but thank you.
Yeah, in fact, we were talking here a bit about this maybe new institutional model being between the traditional art space and cultural center, you know, like. But I wanted to ask you about something else. Did you manage during your work as a curator to implement some changes concerning the way you work or the institutional work? I mean, the institution works. I mean, everything that happens behind the scenes. I don't know, are the employees at Serpentine unionized? Did you manage to, were you interested in this question of working conditions? Mm-hmm. Because I think you mentioned it, but I don't know if this is, if you were trying to, induce some change also in this area, because this is what we are actually really concerned in our research and also during our workshops. And not so much the programming itself, but more everything that happens behind the scenes, the expectations towards us as curators, the number of exhibitions we are supposed to curate, you know, our whole curatorial lifestyle, all this, you know, flying here, flying there, here biennial, you know, I kind of, I'm deeply convinced it has to end, you know, all this flying has to end. But are we working on changing that? But this is just an example, you know.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because actually, weirdly, you just reminded me, before going on maternity, I was the union representative at the Serpentine, but I never felt like I had a particular political engagement as strong and as committed as some of my colleagues did. Not because of not wanting to, but just, as I said to someone in my life once, I was like, I think you're the activist and I'm the diplomat. It's just characteristics of ourselves. And I hadn't connected that with ecological work or how we work with each other and so on. There are some changes that have happened, for sure. The frequency of exhibitions has changed profoundly. Quite a lot of changes have happened on the kind of buildings level, in terms of also just energy management and solar panels and heat pumps and all kinds of things. I wouldn't necessarily want to claim that Serpentine is like a great workplace. I think it has, if you even just look it up, it's like it's got quite a bad reputation as a place to work, because there's this like urgency and everything is just so now. And, you know, there's a lot of institutions. It's not most institutions that are a certain size develop great blame culture. And so, you know, it has tried incredibly hard to implement certain changes, and it has implemented some. And what I would like to do, what I've been working towards now, is to rebirth the supposed the green team, as a team that isn't just sort of meeting and proposing whether to switch this kind of cup to that kind of fork or, paper straws kind of thing, but really to deeply engage with the sense of purpose of the organization. And even though it's not the remit of the ecology team to work on like organizational ecologies, to sort of use the word ecologies loosely enough that somewhere, you can make these kind of different changes. Now, very, very practically, the strategy that I've been working on for 3 years has like a set of aims. And the idea is that the green team goes to every department and every project with this kind of aim palette and goes like, what can we realistically achieve within, what can you take over and what can we realistically achieve? And those aims can be like reducing emissions, of course, platforming, key ideas. So those are, the two typical changing systems, proposing regenerative artworks, building infrastructure for the sector, convening the sector, sheltering, hospicing, all that kind of work, and so forth. So there's the idea is not to create a sort of, also don't get me started on net zero, because there's a whole problem with that, and big problem with net zero. And so all the institutions that make a net zero promise actually really, as far as I know, unless I'm someone, will one day convince me of the opposite, but really don't know how, now that it's quite clear that carbon offsetting is in fact quite detrimental to the environment. So how are you supposed to achieve net zero without disappearing, without closing? I don't quite see the solution, but there's all kinds of things, like you separate your reduction of emissions with your financial contributions towards environmental action. You change your financial contribution of environmental actions from carbon offsetting projects to different kinds of what the Gallery Climate Coalition, which is another organization that I am on the board of, talks about strategic climate funds, which might be like lawyers for the environment or might be investment within the organization's own decarbonization, those kinds of things. So where was I? So the aims are like really, really different, and they go from like meaning to material and from system to organization, and it's probably incomplete. But the idea is really to create a kind of adaptive and flexible system so that every branch of the organization can take ownership over the decisions that it makes. And then have a chain of accountability, obviously, that comes back. So those changes are somehow like slowly being implemented. I wouldn't say that we're anywhere near the sort of workers' condition kind of conversation, to be honest. I mean, I'm not, but it's a big organization, so there's also work happening.
We can fight so that this notion of sustainability also includes this social sustainability, and then this question of working conditions will be also under sustainability, yeah? Because it's also in Germany it's just reduced to this material sustainability, carbon track, and so on. But I think we also that's why we also like this book of Malcolm Ferdinand a lot, because it's bringing this together, yeah, again. So and then if you broaden this, then you get a bigger project, but also for me a more interesting one, to be honest, because that's yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think there's something quite beautiful about ecology as a word, or system, whichever is the word. If you can make it into everything, if it's wide enough to allow you space for action in lots of different things, then you can take the things that you're best at and instill them within, or instill within them ecological or symbiotic or some kind of principle, right? So I suppose it's like, it's where your passion takes you under a particular kind of auspices of a particular kind of logic.
I have a feeling that this language of ecology seems to be a kind of a common language now. Like a lot of people understand this language, and if we just take this social sustainability out of the fight, then we kind of lose a chance to really transform the art system, because now you can say we cannot do so many exhibitions because it's not sustainable concerning our workforce. You can also speak about the carbon track, but you can kind of use this ecological arguments also to advocate for the social sustainability, because so you can actually try to change things that we could not change for a long time in the art system, But there is a very huge effort to reduce the ecology to material sustainability, and then we still remain with the exploitative working conditions, self-exploitation, and then it's
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I suppose that's where the systems piece comes into play. It's like, once you identify the system, how can you meaningfully intervene in that system? I'm escaping your question just because that's not specifically one of the areas of action that I've in any way looked at meaningfully yet. But I think you're absolutely right. It's just
in order to deal with that, we have to program much less because we need time for this kind of work. Yeah, and this is also
programming less is
challenging because there is a huge pressure on big programming, and intense events and so on. So
yeah, I mean, but it's where do you end with this? Programming less is a great idea, but then then it's like there's so many institutions that used to support emerging artists that no longer do so because they do a lot less and they only do the blockbuster shows because those are the ones that are financially sustainable. It's like it kind of you plug a hole on this side and it makes a hole on the other side. I'm not saying that there's no solution, but I'm just sitting with it.
I guess the problem of funding as well, right? Because very often funding structures are aimed still for projects, not really like end projects, like in terms of production of artworks or production of exhibitions, not really to supporting or remunerating the artist throughout the whole process of research, production, and presentation. Yeah. So it's like the problem goes even deeper than how institutions work, but really how do we change the funding behind them?
So I've been having quite a lot of conversations with philanthropic foundations who seem to be having like a moment of deep self-analysis. And what I would really love to do in terms of work with those philanthropic foundations is to really kind of have a space in which we can think about evaluation, measuring impact, but in a space in which we are literally talking to one another as opposed to going like, give me the money and I'll make the report that you need and I'll put in it what you need me to say. And that really try to sort of recognize, and I think there's a lot of really great people recently that I've met in philanthropic foundation, like brilliant systems thinkers, that are recognizing the fact that philanthropic foundations are infrastructure builders by virtue of funding. And so instead of funding project by project, they could be funding systems or strategies. And I cannot tell you the number of funders. They don't currently fund me, but they're our projects, but I hope they will, but they're all in a process of reworking their strategy. All of them. I mean, it's nice, in a sense. It's good.
The philanthropy, because I mean, as soon as you say that, I immediately think about, late stage capitalism, trickle down effect, that they've gained the money through the very structures of oppression, the privilege and all of that.
For sure.
And basically to use them to create further systems. I somehow worry that those systems will also, of course, be off the back of the same oppression, and therefore those systems are still going to just be plug holes into a sinking ship. Mm-hmm. I'm that irritating critical friend.
No, but it's a really good challenge. I mean, I personally think, when you think of it in terms of family dynamic, I always, the Furies in Greek tragedy, the Furies kind of haunt one family line, one after the other. And then you get these moments or these figures that by having, this is so like archetypal, but you get these moments or these figures that by some particular kind of sacrificial moment or something, shore up the Furies from trickling on. And I do think that to a certain extent some projects have a chance to sort of shore up the Furies and the reproductions of things if they do so strategically or intentionally. I think that, and therefore I work in an institution which is funded by private capital, philanthropic foundations, which itself are usually funded by private capital and corporations. Not because I love where the money comes from, although, there are some ethical guidelines about not taking money from X and Y. everyone has different lines. We negotiate them in institutions. But I wouldn't be working in an institution if I didn't think that there was a chance. Although I'm aware of the fact that philanthropy and culture can be a sort of very fancy form of money laundering, for sure. But I think, I mean, am I by the same token saying that I think that capitalism can be fixed and turned into good capital? No, not at all. But so I take the challenge on board is, I think, the most meaningful thing I can say.
Lucia, can you still answer? Because there are more questions coming up. Is it okay for you to answer?
If you're okay to sit here, I'm okay to sit here. But if you need to go, and
Yeah, actually, it's more an observation or something I wanted to comment, because I observed that you were talking about transformation and the social aspects of sustainability. And forgive me, it's just a rough observation because I came very late. But in your slides on what artists or art spaces can do, you were talking about, or you were also mentioning transformation. And for me, it looked more, and then again, looking at semantics and the terms we use, it looked more like actually reforming. So what can you do to fix the system? So fixing for me would be maybe more reform, like a way of reforming the system, while transforming would be and again, we could and we should go for hours, but transformative practices would also include maybe broader in other ideas that relate more to social systems and how we relate to each other, etc.
It's interesting. You've just reminded me that I used to really talk about why manipulation was a good thing, not in like between people, but the person that looks at cult documentaries, but me. But sorry, you weren't there before. I'm making allusions to the afternoon, because manipulation is at its base is sculpture making, and so when thinking about changing an organization potentially from the inside, even in a small way, there's an element of necessary manipulation that you need to do, and maybe that's not all bad. I think the word transforming, maybe it shouldn't be here. The word transforming really belongs to like activism at the moment. Not in a bad way, but in the sense that I'm not sure that I necessarily understand it all that well. I agree with you that there's a kind of reformation of repair. I'm kind of interested in the slippages as well, like repair and reparation. Why does repair and reparation have the same etymology? You know, it's like the metaphor and the material. Does repair and reparation have something to do with acknowledging the fact that the devastation of colonialism and the plundering of things and the destruction of forms of life and being goes at the same time as the destruction of the planet? Probably. And that therefore the fixing of it is necessarily has to factor those things as not kind of dialectic, but joint, probably. You know, there's like interesting kind of slippages between words, and I don't spend my time, again, like, I'm like talking about words and really like going, but I don't care about words. Like, clearly I do. But I care about words when they slide around and do things that are not precise. Yeah, because it's poetry. A friend of mine describes it so beautifully. He describes poetry as, goes in a novel, goes poetry is like a bridge. It doesn't matter the point of a bridge is not that it goes from one place to the other, but that it goes over something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to go over. And so this idea that it creates kind of connections over a gap that is like, if you get stuck in the gap, you'll never get out. And I like this sliding, like when words are like slippery and slidey and can mean all kinds of different things, as opposed to just going, it's this precise word or it's not, and I mean this when I say that. And I'm not criticizing that. It's just not the way that my brain functions. But I think that there's something really playful and exciting about intentionally slipping around. Maybe.
There's a translator and philosopher and poet who calls it gap gardening.
Oh, beautiful.
I know.
Gap gardening. Rosemary Waldrop. Oh.
Can I ask you something? Just going back to around philanthropy, economy, and is it within the ecologies program, economy, something that you also tackle? Because I think, like, structural change and like changing methodology of working between institutions, us, whatnot, it's really connected to economy. So I don't know whether there is a line of inquiry within your thinking and kind of long-term programming, just really experimenting with economy and the way economy is generated and how it's distributed, because I also noticed that some of your relationship with artists and collectives is a long term, which is quite challenging in terms of economies and support. So yeah.
Yes and also no. It's not currently part of the kind of core key questions of the next, let's say, definitely year, maybe in the years after that. But there's definitely on a discursive level a kind of long-term engagement with things like donut economics and a few others of these kind of economists who are really sort of thinking about economics in relation to planetary resources and to planetary balance on a discourse level. On a doing level, there's kind of, I was mentioning tiny budgets. By necessity, there's a necessity to engage with alternative economics forms like barters between collaborative institutions, for example. So, between us and the camera, there's quite a lot of situations in which we exchange. We might curate something for an organization, and that organization might, and then, one example, we curated an artist program as part of the yearly conference of an organization in the UK that looks at decarbonizing the art world called Julie's Bicycle. They got an art program, we got an event platform, and therefore they didn't spend anything. I mean, we obviously paid the artists, but as little as money was spent as possible in terms of making that happen. We didn't need to organize its own event to make a performance in February. We covered it, and they didn't need to go off and create an artist program on top of what they were already doing. So barter economies of that nature. I mean, they're super simple, right? Teaching in a university, and then in exchange, the university might cover the costs of the printing of some kind of outcome. This is what I'm currently kind of looking at for something, and there's many different examples. Barter economy never means not paying freelancers or artists. Just want to put that out there. It's important.
I would like to ask you about how you envision yourself in a future where you would have the perfect conditions to curate inside maybe your own institution or your own organization, or whatever it would be, where you would work as you would love to be, and there are no, let's say, there is no, you could wish how you would like to work, inside the curatorial realm, let's say. So, because I noticed that, there are like different ways of transformation. There's like transformation that's happening inside institutions, like maybe by playing with the rules of the institution or manipulation, whatever. Then you can go outside. There is this Eric Olin Wright who wrote about transformation theory, and then you can go outside, you can find the niche and then go gardening in the niche. And I think you also do that. I see it when you work with artists, and then you travel around and look at interesting projects. And then there is this kind of transformation where you really seek the rupture with it all, like radical maybe, and then say ciao to the art world, say ciao to the institution. I don't want to do anything. I go far away and start afar, whatever. So I'm interested in what is your vision. Do you envisioning yourself working inside Serpentine for, let's say, the next 10 years and create, like trying to push it in a direction that you think is your definition of sustainability, whatever, like in a graceful way? Or where do you see yourself? And then also, how does it maybe connect with your second, how do you say?
Career.
Career?
No,
as
training.
a doula. Is there some, let's say, interconnections there?
I've been joking that, like ballerinas, ballerinas shouldn't retire. I think this 85-year-old ballerina would be wonderful, but ballerinas do actually retire often, become Pilates teachers or physiotherapists. And I think that it would be quite responsible for curators to eventually retire. Not because age is in any way detracts anything from a human being, but because at that point you've probably accumulated so much wisdom that the art world just seems like not, enough. But also because there's just such a sort of scramble for relevance all the time. And I find that I know so many people that are very close to me that are so anxious and unhappy. And like the thing that they loved doing their whole lives now becomes this kind of torture that you can't stop because of, infinite growth principle, So I really hope that at some point, the longest term answer is I really hope that at some point when it's time to go, I will know to go and not hang on to stuff, like particularly discursive or institutional agent power. Which is why, when Florencia is 10 years younger than me, and is this project that you've heard is her master's thesis, and I think that it's miles ahead of where the General Ecology Project not only was 10 years ago, but is now. I see people that are doing work that is better than mine, and I love that. I really want to love that, and so I don't think the death doula is necessarily my actual second career. I need to figure out what's going to actually make money. Not a lot, just some. But I don't imagine doing it forever. I also cannot imagine directing an institution. And that's not to say that, like in the case of, you clearly, Aneta, are doing something so, so profound here that is inspirational, but I find like directors are so stressed and they're so like dependent on the communications team to tell them, and there's so much fear, there's so much like fear for the sustainability of the place and accountability to so many people, and so much like you can't expose any vulnerability ever because then the funding go, there's just so many things that I don't think are compatible with my vision of what being happy is. I curate to understand, and I really I had to come to terms with the fact that even though there's like a deep, purposeful, what I would love to say is like a deep, purposeful engagement with the subject matters that I dedicate myself in, the main driver, really in my heart of hearts, is just understanding that stuff between things. That's my motivation. And so whatever it is, in whatever place, I think, a few years more of that, and then just like some kind of graceful eclipse would be great. Living in a hot country, preferably. Thank you for asking it. Nobody ever asked me that. It's so nice to think about.
Okay, I guess we're arriving at the end of this
At bedtime.
Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you.